Well, everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Infirmary, where I and my guests try to walk all of you through how you can avoid getting hurt or injured or sick or burned out when you are doing endurance work and endurance sports. And today's episode, when we're talking about what training gains are actually durable in terms of duration, came out of a great question from one of the athletes I coach who's here with me today, Robin Cummings. And Robin is also a cycling coach. So if you are interested in working with them, we will have their information in the show notes at the end. But Robin and I were talking about heat training as they were preparing for some fall races. And Robin asked a question about how long are these gains going to kind of stick around? And so when should I start my heat work? Which then begat this larger conversation about like, well, what is durable in terms of all endurance sports? So like what skills and abilities stick around the longest, which disappear first, and under what conditions do they disappear? And so today we're going to talk about how your body decides what stays and goes and how to use that information for your own training. Robin is a coach and an elite cyclist who races both gravel and road and cyclocross. And their big goal in 2026 is to get their road category 1 upgrade, and then also continuing to race effectively at the pointy end of professional gravel racing. Robin, welcome to the Infirmary.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. It's been, quite a while since I've been on a podcast, so it'll be fun to shake off the rest together.
Yeah, this is going to be awesome. First, can you just kind of tell me about walk me through where this question kind of came from? Like talk to me a little about the work that we were doing, and then what made you ask this question?
Yeah, so I'm in a bit of a life transition, started grad school recently, and so my approach to riding and racing this fall and potentially for the next couple years really is going to be much more about trying to build my sort of base level of fitness without the time to travel for racing.
Mhm.
And I figured best way to make use of that time is to stack as many of the durable gains to build future racing fitness on top of.
Nice. And we were working on heat training, and you had kind of said, you like we're headed into cross season, and you had really kind of jumped full bore into doing some heat work. And I think
Hmm.
I asked you, I was like, hey, what are we doing this for? Because, we need to kind of pick the target for this. And I think that's what brought us to this question of yours of
Hmm.
like, well, when should I start the heat training in order for it to be most effective for my goals? And and that sort of led to this question where I was like, well, we start for sure kind of 16 to 18 weeks out from the big event, so maybe here during cyclocross season when we're working on threshold is not like the time to start. um and then how did that, like, where did you go from there to thinking about durability in general?
I think what took me there was trying to think about what would be the best use of my training time
Hmm.
given that sort of restriction. Because the gains that we can get out of heat training are pretty considerable.
Yeah.
I noticed them both subjectively and objectively in terms of sensations and performance numbers. But obviously there are reasons that we're not doing that. Why you asked me if there was an event that I was targeting. Um, and so figuring out what s- sort of uh, sort of things that I can do with that time that will actually be
Hmm.
paid forward instead of dissipate after a couple of weeks, not hitting the sauna several times a
Yeah.
day.
Right, because what was your experience of like doing the heat training work? Like, one of the things we had added was doing some like Z1 riding before
Hmm.
you got in the sauna, and you had a real response to that change. And what was your experience of sauna in after doing that sort of moderate intensity riding?
That was so much harder. Um, Getting into the sauna with your heart rate already not outrageously high, even with the relatively short transition I had, was still worlds different than going in there starting at my resting heart rate. And And does your mind tell you that you need to get out of there when you're just sitting and your heart rate is in threshold zone,
Mhm.
even if it's something that you can comfortably do for hour or 2 hours without too much mental distress on the bike?
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, essentially what's happening, your body is getting signals that it's dying, that it's cooking,
Yep.
and so and that's going to lead in pretty nicely to what we talk about with in terms of physiology in general today. But in that approach, to get the heart rate up before you go into the sauna, if the rest of you go back and listen to the podcast about heat training, that's that isothermic approach that is talked about in the study that we talked about, where what you do first is sort of ride at a moderately hard intensity. And if you're doing that in a warm environment already, your heart rate and your core temperature will get high quickly. And if your heart rate is and core temp is already up when you go in the sauna, yeah, like, I think your first time you made it 17 minutes, and previously you'd been making it like 30 minutes more, but then you're kind of like, oh wow, so that like 13 plus minutes, probably my core temperature wasn't at that 38.5 degrees
Hmm.
Celsius. That's the
Hmm.
number that we're trying to get to. And we'll talk about that kind of when we get to the end about, okay, what are some of the strategies here? You're a coach yourself, you're working with a few athletes at the moment, and I imagine that's where the like, what does durability even mean come from, as you're trying to balance the juggling act of trying to help another athlete develop as well.
Definitely, definitely. I one of the athletes I work right now with is a junior cyclocross racer, and as our listeners may be aware, the way junior cyclocross racing ages are delineated is by 2 year blocks. And so he just moved up into the younger of those first two age blocks, or the younger 2 years of a new age block, I should say.
Mhm.
And so this year he is certainly going to compete, but competing with the knowledge that a significant portion of his competitors are a year ahead of him, and in the 15, 16 age range, or excuse me, 14, 15 age range, that that 1 year can look like a whole lot of different growth. So think looking at it as a year to gain experience, and then
Mhm.
sort of build hopefully some durable adaptations to take forward once his hormones have done some additional work for him. It's
Yeah.
part of what we're doing this
Yeah,
year.
that's one of the huge challenges of coaching juniors, right? Like the difference in coaching a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old, is massive. And then, I mean, most of the populations that you and I are going to work with are firmly established adults. Generally, most endurance athletes don't really hire a coach until they're like 30 plus. And the difference between like a 32-year-old and a 36-year-old is almost nothing. There's like a very tiny like aging effect that might be happening, but oh my gosh, like 14 to 18 is huge. And so if you are in the bottom half of your age group at that point, then yeah, you're going to be better served by how can I develop my physiology so that I'll be even better next year. But this goes into something that you bump into all the time. I mean, what is the most important race to most athletes?
The next one, of course,
Yeah, totally.
or the last one.
100%. Right, exactly. So it's a really narrow window, like what's coming up and what I just did. And that's never going to change with athletes. That's usually what they're going to focus on. But our job as coaches is to have that more strategic view, which is why I think this is such a cool question, and it kind of leads into our first topic today, which is our bodies are inherently lazy. And when I say that, like, talk me through that. How do you interpret that statement?
I think the first thing I think of when I hear that statement is it makes perfect sense. Even if you're not an athlete, you can think of you you sit on the couch, you get up, you go to the fridge to get some food or something like that. Your heart rate goes up when you get up and walk to the fridge because it takes more effort. But
Hmm.
once you sit back down, your body's heart rate is going to drop again because your body doesn't want to work any harder than it has to.
Hmm.
And that's true at so many different levels. I know one of the things that we were talking about earlier was the heat training and
Hmm.
the heat training and altitude training, I should say, and that both of those adaptations, the or two of the main ones being increased blood plasma volume and increased hemoglobin mass. Both those are pretty metabolically expensive to actually sustain.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Another, an example that usually makes sense to a lot of people that aren't yet fully in this world is a bodybuilder. And that's not what we're doing as endurance athletes, but lean muscle mass is like also very metabolically expensive. I would put those two that you mentioned, blood plasma and hemoglobin, like that's really up there. Lean muscle mass is also like very energetically intensive.
Hmm.
This is one of the reasons, this is, sort of one of the unfair reasons that if you are lean, it's easier to stay lean, because it costs more energy to
Hmm.
maintain the muscle mass
Hmm.
you have. If you have a higher percentage of lean muscle mass to body fat or adipose tissue, your engine and your body just takes more to run it. And and so a bodybuilder, their goal is to sort of hit their performance or their competition with the highest amount of lean muscle mass as they can get. And you can't maintain that level of intensity year round. It's very similar to endurance athletes where it's like, yeah, you can peak twice a year probably.
Hmm.
And then you need to let your body rest. Otherwise, you're just going to get totally burned out. But if maintaining that amount of muscle mass as a bodybuilder is really hard. And as soon as you stop maintaining it, your body is going to be like, oh, thank God. Like, let's get rid of some of this very expensive muscle mass and get back to something that is more sustainable. And if we kind of keep that in front of us as we talk about what does durable even mean, I think that's probably a good kind of way to start talking about this whole thing. Um, okay, so when I put out, I put in for this list of like we've got a list of durable adaptations. When I put in this concept here about last hired, first fired, like a lot of what we do here at the infirmary is like trying to make these concepts a little bit more like, okay, how do we understand this from something that I'll experience in my own life?
Hmm.
And most of us have had this experience of like, okay, yeah, if you were the most recent person hired, you're probably the person who goes out the door first if the company needs to contract. What does that mean from a like a physiological perspective?
Uh, in short, what another quick way of putting it is easy come, easy go. The adaptations that we achieve most immediately after the stimulus and that require the lowest amount of that stimulus to acquire are going to be the quickest to leave us.
Yeah.
And as anybody who's done a decent amount of endurance training knows that the lower intensity stuff is what requires the most volume. It's what we do in just about any situation
Hmm.
earliest in the season, and then there's a inverse relationship, whereas you increase the intensity, the amount required to get those adaptations goes down, and the time that they last also goes down.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And like, I think, like you've been an endurance athlete for like a long time, most of your life,
Too long.
and I think this is something that both like lifelong athletes miss, and then also newer athletes miss also, because like for you or somebody who has been doing endurance training most of their lives, like those abilities are pretty well ingrained. Um, and it's not just like a physical ability, like you have developed a habit around your endurance training.
Hmm.
And so there's less friction for you to get out the door and go for a bike ride. Like
Hmm.
it's part of who you are, it's part of what you do. Um, and probably like just going out for a 2 hour, when I put a just go ride 2.5 hours, that's not difficult for you. It's not difficult for you habit wise. It's not
Nope.
difficult for you physiologically. So why do we do that workout? Why does that even show up on your calendar? Why are there like little patches, where because most of your training is a lot of just go ride. When we're in a period where we're doing, real interval work, that's not cyclocross season where your intervals are your race days.
Mhm.
Um, your training looks like a lot of just go riding and then some focused intervals. Why is that just go riding there? Why do we need to have that in the calendar?
Uh, I mean, as we were just mentioning earlier, just because it doesn't the adaptations from that sort of lower intensity stimulus, just because they last a while, doesn't mean that we need to or don't need to continuously top them off.
Yeah.
Because along with the fact that they last a while, they require the most volume in order to actually achieve those adaptations. So just constantly topping off the tank
Hmm.
is the best way of doing that. If my schedule were a little bit different, maybe it wouldn't be the same
Hmm.
number of 2, 3 hour just go rides. Instead, maybe once a week you would be giving me 8 hour just go ride zone two because with cycling it's a little bit easier to clump up that volume
Hmm.
and not have a detrimental effect on one's joints
Yeah.
as you might be running. Yeah.
And if, like, say you opened up your training calendar one week, and we're looking at a block, and instead of, what if I replaced all of those just go rides with like tempo rides? Like what like what would your reaction to that be as an experienced endurance athlete and a coach? Like if you suddenly saw that instead of a lot of just go rides, you had on your calendar a whole bunch of, like, I want you to go ride 3 hours at 250 to 280 watts. Like, how would you respond to that?
I would say that you would be overly accommodating to me as an athlete. You said I love that,
Tell me
but
more about that.
I
Unpack
love
that
tempo
for me.
riding. I love tempo riding, and I know it is not the most efficient way to do all of my training. I've learned that the hard way. Um, yeah, it would be, you'd be overloading me,
Yeah, totally. You get
and
really
maybe it
tired really
wouldn't.
fast.
Yeah, maybe I would last a week, maybe 10 days, but yeah, I would certainly be too much pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I think that, that's like one of the things that I hope comes out of this is, like, again, we really want more people to be riding at lower and moderate intensities
Hmm.
because, yes, like if you were able, like in like a peak training block for you where you're getting 22 to 25 hours of training a week, almost 20 of those are going to be our Z1, so the
Yeah.
rest of the world Z2, like pretty moderate. If you tried to do 20 hours of tempo work, yeah, you would get a bump in fitness that would be bigger than 20 hours of zone 1 work, but you would probably also not be able to train the following week. So it's not worth the trade-off. And, like, that's part of this durability discussion, is that we an effective training strategy is a very old school training strategy where it's like we do a lot of lower intensity work and then we kind of go up the ladder
Hmm.
through these other abilities. Um, but you brought up something that is different from exercise intensity in a back and forth that we had. And can you walk us through what that difference was and why you asked about it?
Yeah, I mean the the thing that just sort of lies outside the other adaptations is a little bit less tangible, but still applicable to every endurance sport, and that's skills.
Yeah.
For cycling, that can look like bike handling skills. It can also just look like generalized mechanical efficiency or what your position would be on a tri bike, even more
Mhm.
important. But even if you're a road cyclist, very, very much relevant. Um, Knowing how to fuel correctly, knowing your body and how to listen to it. All of these things are not easily quantifiable. I bet you people have done so,
Mhm.
um, and are not the things that our mind immediately goes to. But
Mhm.
as I mentioned earlier, I'm coaching a junior cyclocross rider, and a significant portion of his weekly volume, because it isn't super high, is skills work.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't see him all that often, especially during the off season. And watching him race earlier this season for the first time since December, uh, those skill sessions sure did work, and he's riding circles around me now.
Nice. When did you start your skills work as an endurance athlete in your life? Like, when did that begin?
I don't know. It's hard to pinpoint like a specific time. I would say not quite as an endurance athlete, but where I first sort of conceived myself as an athlete and really implemented some degree of structure, at the very least repetition, to try and dial down a skill was as a freestyle skier when I was
Mm-hmm.
younger. And that looked like just setting up a single, usually a simple down rail in a terrain park
Mm-hmm.
and hitting that down rail, unclipping from my skis and hiking it again and again and again until I felt like I had the trick or tricks dialed down that I wanted to. And actually, how I got into cycling was a couple of ACL tears
Mm-hmm.
when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and I was pleasantly surprised how quickly some of those skills still came back after 9 to 12 months off skis due to injury. Just they were still there, and they came back a whole lot easier than the physical strength that I had lost post surgery.
Yeah. And what are the skills that you learned in that freestyle skiing that have crossed over to your cycling?
Um, the the just bl- blunt repetition aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Once you feel like you've got at least a handle on what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
If I was, say, trying to work on my backflips, if I'm getting 3/4 of the way through the backflip, catching my noses and double ejecting, like, then I'm not going to just be doing flat out repetition because there's something that I need to improve,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just repeat the correct thing. But once you have the skill down, repeating it and getting it smoother and smoother to really strengthen those new neurological connections, was and is a
Mm-hmm.
fundamental part of building a skill.
Yeah.
Another example, I after many years of trying, finally learned to bunny hop barriers for cyclocross
Mm-hmm.
like 10 days ago at this point. And I was just sessioning a friend's barriers at a race, and and a single barrier. And as soon as the race finished, I went back out on the race course to actually take it to a course and do it on what felt like a race situation and on a double set of barriers to really, again, take advantage of having just built up those new neurological connections and take them a step further to really, be able to immediately utilize them.
Did the freestyle skiing teach you anything about like reading a downhill or descending effectively that you've taken over into cycling?
For that part of things, I can't say in that
Uh-huh.
I don't remember learning to ski, and the like skills of reading terrain. Yeah, I have no doubt that I built them.
Hmm.
But like they're so deeply ingrained in me at this point that I don't think about them at all.
And what you're hitting on is something that will be a source of relief for people who did some skills work in their chosen sport or crossover sport early in their life, and then also some frustration for those people who picked it up later in life. And I coach a lot of triathletes, and a lot of triathletes come to cycling and running pretty easily. I mean, the general pathway into triathlon is you're a runner and you sort of get the bug of endurance events and then you hurt yourself. And and because you've hurt yourself, somebody is like, hey, maybe you should think about cycling. It's a low impact ability. It's a way to kind of like, some of those gains are still going to cross over into your running, but you can extend your running career by picking up a bike and riding maybe a third of the amount of time that you run each week. And then that runner enjoys cycling. I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. And they realize they're just one sport away from doing a triathlon. And then they bump into the horrifying reality of swimming, which is essentially if you try to learn swimming when you're an adult, it's as difficult as learning golf. And I bet it would also be not the same level of consequences as trying to learn freestyle skiing as an adult,
I would say
but
so.
technically very similar challenges of
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
really having to know proprioception, where your body is in space. And I mean, like, that's in, freestyle skiing and swimming are probably closer than swimming and golf, because the thing I always say to people about swimming is like, of course this is uncomfortable. You are a bipedal, you're an upright bipedal mammal, and you exist in a medium that you can extract oxygen from the air pretty easily. When you're swimming, you are now a quadrupedal horizontal mammal, but you're in an environment that you can't extract oxygen from. And so it's actually a lethal environment in the same way that freestyle skiing can be very dangerous. So I think that's for those of you that are trying to learn swimming, it is as difficult as maybe difficult as, to like get on some skis and learn some very technical jumps and something like that. You're in this great position where, like you just said, a lot of those skills of, managing downhills, you can't remember learning it, but it's in there. And that has probably given you a leg up, and you're a very good bike handler on developing those skills as an adult or furthering those skills as an adult. And so, in our big list here of like, what is, the most durable, I think when you asked me that question, we sort of kicked it around a little bit and we were like, well, skills are the most durable if you learned them early.
Yep. Yep.
And if you have had to learn them as an adult, they're going to require the same kind of upkeep that, that we're talking about with like an energy system. So if you're new to swimming, you are probably going to be doing technique work way more often in a given week than you are going to be doing fitness work. And so we said before there was going to be a lot of it depends today. But I think we can go out on a limb and say skills are the most durable if you learn them early. And if you're learning them as an adult, they're probably going to require the same level of upkeep of your endurance work, which is that it has to happen a lot. Okay, so skills are the top. Next most durable, I think we've already covered basically endurance work, but you have to be comfortable with the fact that you're going to be doing it very often in your training week. Um, and this is disheartening to people where they realize that most of their training is actually just maintenance of what you have, like keeping that endurance work in place. The more training history you have in your body, the less maintenance you have to do. So you have to do a little less than somebody who has been training for, comparatively fewer years.
Of course.
But then on the flip side, your big goals next year are around, performing in high level road racing and gravel racing, both of which require huge aerobic volumes to have success. So you still are going to be doing, probably 75 to 80% of your weekly work is just keeping what you have in place and like
Hmm.
slightly developing it. Okay, what's next on the list after we cover skills and basic endurance?
Well, I mean, I could look at the document that we got, or we could just go by the next higher intensity up energy system, and that is threshold.
Yeah, totally. And like we've sort of skipped tempo as well. And that kind of speaks to our earlier discussion. Like tempo's not really a thing. Like it's just like more intense endurance. And the same way that threshold is like sort of the most intense endurance range. Coley Moore at Empirical Cycling has a great term for it, just calls it spicy endurance, which I think is really good because it suggests that it's still in the endurance kind of
Hmm.
domain. But we can't ignore the adaptations of threshold, right? It's the thing that's gonna determine, it's not gonna determine your ultimate performance, but it will determine whether or not you belong in your chosen category. So like the higher threshold you have in cycling, you're going to be able to hang in a Cat 2 race. If
Hmm.
it's higher than that, you're going to be able to hang with the group in a Cat 1 race. If your threshold is around 400 to 420 watts, welcome to the domestic professional field. And then if your threshold is in the 440 to 450 range, welcome to, a very select group of cyclists on the planet. But yeah, I mean, threshold is a peripheral adaptation. It's predominantly in the muscles. And so, just like strength training, you got to use it. In your particular calendar, like when we're a threshold block, what does that look like for you in terms of like how many minutes or hours of threshold per week have you experienced this year when we're doing a threshold block? And we're kind of in one right now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the one we're in right now is definitely a little unusual, and then I'm also doing a couple of cross races a week. And that the overall volume thus is pretty significantly constricted.
Hmm.
Um, but overall volume week, gosh, my memory is not great, but my guess is it probably capped out between 90 and 120 minutes at the back end of a threshold block.
Yeah.
And as regular listeners of the show probably know, like to be building overall time in threshold from one week to another, as well as building the time and threshold for each individual workout
Yeah.
within those weeks. So usually starting at like 60 and then over the block increasing to between 90 and 120.
Yeah, totally. And again, this is one of those cases where, like, because of where you are at lifetime in terms of an athlete, like, you're going to start your threshold blocks where, like, an individual workout, I might start you at 5 by 10, 4 by 12, something like that. Most other people might start at like 3 by 10, 4 by 8, like a little closer to that 30-minute range. And then we build up from there. And yeah, I think like some of your bigger weeks, we're getting close to 2 hours of total, time and zone in threshold. What are those weeks like?
uh, Depends on if we want to start. Usually my Mondays are recovery days. This I
Hmm.
think is not universal, but I think pretty common for most endurance athletes. So it would, yeah, start with that. Tuesday or Wednesday tends to be the first of the two threshold
Hmm.
workouts. And then a lot of just go ride.
Yeah.
Usually 2 days of that, maybe a running workout, potentially some lifting sometimes, whether that's uh off the bike work, let's say lifting or some mobility or core work of some sort. And then typically Saturday for the second round of threshold work, assuming that we've um, got something structured in there, or maybe a kind of higher intensity group ride situation.
Hmm.
And then cleaning things up with usually the biggest ride of the week on Sunday.
Yeah. And how challenging are those blocks? Like when you're looking at a 4 to 6 week block of that kind of training, like how challenging is that for you as you're kind of looking forward to those blocks and then experiencing them?
It gets harder throughout a week, and then rest day, and then the next week starts a little bit harder, and the pattern repeats.
Uh-huh.
Worse off the end of week two than I am at the end of week one, and that pattern continues through the 4 to 6 weeks. Um, really straight, like really can tell that I'm metabolically scraping the bottom of the barrel and having to feed more aggressively.
Mhm.
Especially at the end of the last 2 weeks usually. And man, that last threshold workout, I am throwing back the gels
Yeah.
constantly.
And then that's usually when I hear that from you when you're like, "Hey, I'm really starting to get tired." Like it's like, okay, that's when we start being like, "Okay, it's time to take a recovery chunk," which then usually looks like a solid 7 to 10 days of riding really easy.
Hmm.
Because you need, I mean, it takes, if you do a threshold block of 4 to 6 weeks, it's not actually going to show up in your physiology for basically like 3 to 5 weeks, and like that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this now here in September, because I think if you're a coach or you're a self-coached athlete, you're thinking about 2026, and it's like, okay, well, if I want to work on my threshold, like, well, first thing first, I probably have to put in a couple months of base. And then, like, if I'm shifting to threshold work, that's another 4 to 6 weeks. we're already 10 to 12 weeks down the road.
Yeah.
And so you really need to kind of plan for this because you're not going to see those threshold benefits until like if you start training today with 2 months of base and then 4 to 6 weeks of threshold, you're not seeing those developments in your threshold until 4 months from now. So like for a lot of people that are targeting, like Valley of the Sun, it's a
Yeah.
February
Yep.
race. Like you got to start this work a few weeks from now, like that kind of thing. Um, the next thing that we put up on the list here is muscular force and power. I kind of put this along with threshold because
Hmm.
lifting and strength is also a peripheral adaptation. Like what we're doing when we're lifting is we're really working our muscles.
Hmm.
The big divide here is between peripheral and central. If you're not familiar, folks, with that distinction, peripheral is your muscles and everything that supports it. So, like, how many capillaries actually are feeding the muscles? Like how much oxygen can you drop off at those working muscles? And then, so threshold is a big peripheral thing, lifting is a peripheral thing. And then we contrast that with central, which is like what can your heart and your lungs and your nervous system do? And we're going to get into central here in a second when we talk about VO2 max. But if we're, as from our example with bodybuilding, lifting, you gotta use it or you lose it. And so the thing that we usually do with endurance athletes is we try to do a big block of it in the wintertime because endurance work and strength work really fight each other. Endurance work is essentially catabolic in nature, it breaks down, and strength work is anabolic in nature, it builds up. um so for strength and for an endurance athlete that wants to incorporate strength, you probably want to do a bunch of this work in the wintertime, maybe even 2 or 3 lifts a week. But you can keep it in place by just lifting heavy once a week once you're into training. So it's probably about as durable as threshold, which is why I put it here, where it's like if you get your threshold up to a certain point, you can keep it in place if you're focusing on something else by doing maybe one threshold session a week. And like so for that athlete that then shifts into our next energy system, VO2 max, we can keep threshold work around probably by just doing a bunch of VO2 max workouts and just doing some disco rides. But strength wise, I would put this strength is sort of as durable as threshold, but our next energy system, VO2 max, is going to be less durable. So why don't you tell us a little bit about VO2 max, what we're trying to do with it, and why it is going to be less durable than some of our like peripheral gains like threshold or strength.
Yeah, so the VO2 max, as you would kind of touch on a little bit there, is more of a central adaptation with the biggest sort of physiological marker that we're looking at to identify if VO2 max work has been successful, is if we are increasing stroke volume of the heart. And the primary way that adaptation comes about for VO2 max work is more with regards to cardiac tissue contractility
Yep.
rather than increasing plasma volume. Whereas increasing plasma volume, that would be one of the big adaptations of heat training.
Yep.
But given that stroke volume is a product of uh, contractility and plasma volume, um, broadly speaking, then addressing either end of it is going to result in the same thing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's one of you've hit on one of the reasons why like high intensity interval training quote works. Because like when you do high intensity interval training, and for this, we always got to define these terms because nobody does, but like high intensity interval training, I would say, is like 2 minutes to 5 minutes of pretty flat out but not maximal effort.
Hmm.
And we see a lot of this in the training zeitgeist of like you just need to do
Yes.
high intensity interval training or sprint interval training, which might be 15 to 30 seconds of
Yep.
truly all out work. um when you start a hit program, as we talked about before, your body is going to be like, what the heck is going on? Like, and it needs to meet that demand. And the way that it's going to meet that demand is by by plasma volume and blood volume going up. Because, if plasma volume goes up, your blood volume is also going to go
Right.
up. So what happens when you, like, say you start doing trainer road or like programs that are only short, high intensity interval work, you're going to see a real boost in performance within the next 4 or 6 weeks. And then those gains are going to stop. And, when you're talking about VO2 max, you're talking about a much more long-term adaptation in terms of, like, if you change how flexible your heart tissue is, that takes a long time to change it because you're literally changing how your heart functions, but it takes a long time for it to unchange.
Hmm.
And so that's what we're after with VO2 max. You're totally right. If we can make the heart chambers more flexible, we get more stroke volume. And we're getting more stroke volume from a more durable place, which is if the heart can contract more flexibly, we can pump more blood with each heartbeat versus higher stroke volume just because you have more basically water in the system, which is what's happening with the plasma volume. Um, that said, VO2 max is still going to be less durable than your threshold work or your endurance work. And as you age, it gets progressively harder and harder to maintain that VO2 max. That's why it's such a big buzzword these days in terms of the longevity and mortality things. Whenever we're endurance coaches, we got to keep ourselves separate from the longevity coaches, which is fine. Totally cool thing that they're aiming for, but it's different. Um, for a population that simply wants to be healthy longer, yes, VO2 max is important, but they're going to be trying to keep their VO2 max in the 40s. Whereas, like, we're training athletes for performance depending on their age. We want, 55 to, you know, if we get lucky once in our careers, we get a 90 VO2 max athlete,
Yeah.
which is a really fun thing to have on your hands. Um, so again, but now the question I'll ask you about VO2 max blocks, basically the same question that I asked you about threshold. But what I want you to compare and contrast here is the weekly volume of the time and zone for VO2 max versus threshold.
Hmm. Hmm. Before I get to that, I just wanted to bring us back to one of our earlier concepts in terms of the body being lazy.
Yeah.
And we will look at the two different ways of effectively increasing stroke volume, one
Mm-hmm.
being increasing blood volume slash plasma volume, and the other being contractility. It takes a whole lot less metabolically to maintain or even just restructure your heart tissue to be more flexible and more
Yep.
have higher contractility as a result than to sustain adding your blood volume. Even just metabolically maintaining temperature homeostasis with that increased volume of water in your body is a much, much higher metabolic demand than
Mm-hmm.
making some alterations to your heart tissue makeup rather, and it's again makeup rather than actually adding heart tissue. So go back to that initial concept of we're lazy, our bodies are
Mm-hmm.
lazy. Looking at what actually lasts in the context um, of stroke volume makes a whole lot of sense. In terms of what a VO2 max block looks like for me as an athlete, the volume is way, way lower. Um, Threshold block volume is not all that dissimilar to a base block. Sometimes it's as high or higher, depending on exactly where we're at in the mesocycles. But VO2 max work is the time and zone specifically is, gosh, probably like 20 minutes a week is the high end of things.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 25 if we're really, really pushing it. And that is, again, 2 workouts a week, but that is very much 2 workouts a week tops. Or one workout a week earlier on in the block is pretty normal, whereas threshold usually we try and fit in
Mm-hmm.
two workouts, and otherwise a lot of lower intensity recovery time because it
Yep.
is just very, very demanding on the body. I know this, and I am always still constantly surprised by how fatigued and how much rest I required, despite that
Mhm.
lower overall volume.
Yeah, it's funny. The to get to extend the point you just made about that blood volume and plasma volume is like more metabolically difficult to maintain, and that a change in your heart tissue is less expensive. Like 100% true at the maintenance level. At the incurring the difference, like making that change in heart tissue, and you're sort of talking around it right now, those are some uncomfortable workouts. Those are those high cadence VO2 max workouts. Those really hurt. Um, and whereas like blood volume or stroke volume, as we were saying, we can get that through means of like altitude work or heat training work, where it's a little less painful. But like we said, they don't stick around as much. But if you're doing the cardiac remodeling, that's what we're talking about, is like, can we change the contractile nature of the heart? Incredibly difficult in the moment, but then strategically it's easier to keep around because, we're just like, okay, once it's up there, we can maintain it through, the other kind of work that we're doing. Um, Okay, we got two left here in terms of our list. Anaerobic capacity. So this is an easy one because this one is essentially polish. Like we do our anaerobic capacity work in the last 3 or 4 weeks before a big event.
Hmm.
Um, if it's something the athlete needs, like if you already have the ability to get into breakaways or cross gaps or leave a group in a cyclocross race, that sort of thing. If that's already in place, you don't need anaerobic capacity work. Unfortunately, most of us are not super gifted in that area.
I
Um,
sure am not.
yeah, it's a thing that like a lot of people aren't. It's pretty. I mean, you do have people who are natural pursuiters, like people who
Hmm.
just like that's what they were born with, and they're like, they don't. They're like, this is trouble for you riding 60 kilometers an hour for a minute. It's not trouble for me. And you're like, screw you. But you know, anaerobic capacity is probably the clearest in terms of the last hired, first fired, because you do 2 or 3 weeks of work of it as you're coming to a race. You do the race, you get into your recovery block, you start doing endurance training. 3 or 4 weeks after that race, a lot of that anaerobic capacity is going to
Hmm.
have shrunk or disappeared. And it's easy to add it and it disappears easily. I would rather do an anaerobic capacity workout than a high cadence VO2 max workout because, they're painful. Like a minute all out is like not fun, but you get like 9 or 10 minutes of rest in between each of the intervals.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if your time and zone for a VO2 max workout is, 20, 25 minutes, that's a lot. Your time and zone for an anaerobic capacity workout for the same like 90-minute session, it might be 4 minutes. And everything else is just incredibly easy pedaling. So like
Yep.
the total load isn't huge. Um, and so then that brings us to our last short-term physiological adaptation, so altitude and heat training. And this is
Hmm.
something, this is the whole reason we're having this discussion. So
Yeah.
talk me through that. And we've sort of visited it a little bit already, but why why are they so fragile, I guess is the term to use as opposed to durable?
Uh, I'd kind of touched on it earlier, but in short, the metabolic demand that they place in the body is really, really high. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and our bodies, if not forced to or continuously stimulated in order to do so, just don't like it.
Yep.
Um, I know there have been some studies coming out recently that have looked at using heat adaptation to sustain the effects of altitude adaptations.
Mm-hmm.
And continuing heat stimulus is, of course, also going to prolong heat stimulus adaptations that had initially occurred. Um, but as with the other, if you don't use it, you lose it systems. They go away pretty quickly. Usually, I believe in the 2 week range for both of them.
Yeah. And one of the big reasons for this is like, when you go out on a just go ride, if you are still riding your bicycle, like you are still engaging in an activity, and like maybe you go up and over a short steep hill, and that requires a little bit of that anaerobic capacity work, or you get excited and you sort of turn up the speed for about 3 minutes or something, and you get a little tiny, not stimulus, but you sort of touch that VO2 max area. And that sends a signal to your body, hey, this stuff needs to be here. If you don't live in a hot environment, or if you're not able to do the sleep high, train low, yeah, of that we really want out of altitude, you're literally getting zero stimulus
Yep.
for that
Yep.
particular thing. And, so our bodies are lazy, and we might also say that our bodies are not incredibly smart. And so, like, if you just send a little bit of stimulus in the direction of your body for those VO2 max, threshold, anaerobic capacity, just by riding your bike, they'll be a little bit more durable. But if you're literally not doing any heat exposure or altitude exposure, your body has no signal. So it's like, oh, get this out of here. Get rid of these extra blood cells. Get rid of this plasma volume. We shouldn't be paying for this. We don't want to be paying rent on something that we're not using. And so those kind of disappear quickly. Um, Okay, so our third kind of thing, how does this shape our training? So, one of the things we're talking about today is your goals for 2026, so get that Cat 1 upgrade. Aiming for, with that Category 1 upgrade, we sort of know that there's a kind of watts per kilogram that we'll want to hit for, to put you in the ballpark of being a Category 1 cyclist.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things that we've always worked on with you is how do we build speed so that you can both get into breakaways and cross gaps and and win races in the end. Um, you also want to be successful at these long distance gravel races, which means your first lactate threshold, your LT1, that
Mhm.
has to be really high. Like that's that threshold that people ignore. It's sort of that crossover between the moderate to heavy exercise domain. But if you want to be fast for 7 hours, like that LT1 has to be pretty high. So that's one thing that we're kind of working on. Um, and again, you're going to need a high blood volume and a high hematocrit and oxygen carrying capacity to achieve that. And one of the races you do most years is Tour de Bloom. It's a
Mhm.
an awesome stage race here in the Pacific Northwest, and it's got you need to have a good threshold. You need to have good VO2 max and climbing abilities because it's a very lumpy race. Um, you need to be a good crit rider. There's a
Mhm.
nighttime crit, so like you have to have some really solid skills there. So what do we need to do to hit those goals for you to be successful by April? And like we lined this out a little bit in our rundown, but you already know all of this stuff. If we're going to achieve those goals, what is what would a sensible training approach look like to kind of get you there if we're thinking about these concepts of durability?
Yeah. I mean, we're we're starting out with a base, or well, we're not actually starting out with a base. We're doing these a little bit differently.
Hmm.
In that I am doing the cyclocross race season, definitely approaching it both mentally and training wise differently from a typical season, and that just racing to have fun. There,
Hmm.
community aspect to it is something that I think we're really spoiled with in Portland and Oregon more broadly. Just so many
Hmm.
friends, such a wonderful experience to be able to race, whether you're actually racing or not, and whether you're trying to win or not. Anyway, starting out with a threshold block as a result of that, we'll do some testing and then figure out what we need to focus on. We already have a pretty good idea. We've been working together for a while. We've got plenty of
Mm-hmm.
training data, have a pretty good idea of what I look like as an athlete and how my body generally responds to stimulus. But so threshold, some retesting, then we'll likely do, depending on what the results of testing are, probably anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks of base.
Mm-hmm.
Um, might be on the shorter end if I end up having some earlier season goals than bloom. And then we'll start doing some heat work.
Mm-hmm.
Again, exactly when that starts will be dependent on if I do something earlier.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned a little bit earlier in the episode, generally want to start to work on that between 16 and 18 weeks out from the events.
Mm-hmm.
So December or January would be really the latest that we would start working on that. Once we've done that base, then we go back to threshold again, 4 weeks, probably do some retesting after that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for me, given my relative weaknesses as an athlete, we might potentially work in some max power effort into the second threshold block, I would imagine. Getting a little bit of that stimulus with cyclocross as is, but something that generally need to make sure I stay on top of because closing gaps is something that I tend to struggle with as a smaller rider.
Mm-hmm.
That places us somewhere between January and February, and at that point, we'll probably start to transition to potentially some more or potentially some higher intensity stuff, likely VO2
Mm-hmm.
max, maybe anaerobic capacity, but that's likely to be more in March as we get closer to bloom. Would be earlier if there's something that's earlier on the calendar. And then, assuming I have something earlier on the calendar, we would maybe be doing that anaerobic capacity work and then using those earlier season race blocks to maintain the anaerobic capacity gains from non-race work.
Yeah. And one of the things we've done before too is like some of those weeks where we kind of do both anaerobic capacity and VO2 max. I'll give you the thing where I'm asking you to do some really big power numbers for 30 to 45 seconds with a lot of
Mm-hmm.
rest. But then the next day is that like 4x4 VO2 max or 4x5, that kind of thing. Like you can cheat a little bit of that. Like, so maybe if you're in a VO2 max block, maybe you do like some of that anaerobic capacity work as like the opener when you're fresh before that
Mm-hmm.
first VO2 max work. The second VO2 max workout of the week, probably don't put another anaerobic capacity work in front of that. I mean, I would say, if we're going to boil things down, regardless of your sport, if you're a single sport athlete or a triathlete, like, please don't do more than 3 interval workouts a week. Like, you're
God,
just going
no.
to hurt yourself, and with a triathlete, like swimming is a little different, but not really. Like, I would really not want a triathlete to be doing 2 threshold swims, 2 threshold bikes, and a threshold run a week. That sounds like you're really going to hurt that athlete, like, yeah. So depending on the block, maybe if it's a swim block, it's like, okay, let's do 2 threshold sessions, a single threshold workout on the bike. And at the moment, at that particular time, the run has to be maintenance. So
Mm-hmm.
you're just doing endurance work. And maybe the only speed you're doing for those blocks are some strides, some like 4 to 6, 15-second pickups where you're just keeping that muscle memory of what it's like to run fast. But yeah, I mean, by that time, if we get into March or April, we're probably going to be doing a patch like that. And this whole time the heat training would be continuing. And usually what we do with the heat training, we do a big block up, a big amount up front when intensity is low. And then if you do that, you can keep the heat stuff around by really only getting into the sauna or doing some heat training once a week and then revisiting a more intense block every 3 or 4 weeks or something like that. Well, I think that's kind of it. We're kind of coming to the end, but like, the conclusion that I want to drop off here is, when you're thinking about what gains you want as an athlete, if you're self-coached or you're coaching somebody else, you need to think about what you're trying to do in a really strategic way. And you need to know how long an energy system needs to be stimulated in order to realize those gains. And then you also need to know how long you need to wait after you stimulate those areas for those gains to show up. And, the reason why I think this is such an interesting question is your question kind of got at the heart of like, how do we coach? Like,
Hmm.
how
Hmm.
do we, and I think that a lot of athletes, what they fall into is this idea that your workouts need to look like your races. But if you were to do all of your workouts that look like Cat 1, Cat 2 road races, you would be burnt out in a few weeks. That would be
Hmm.
but we see people who do that, who their only training is like, I just want to go on group rides. And you're like, oof, that's a lot of sweet spot work, and those athletes tend to be fit, but they never tend to get better. And that's the thing that we need to think about as athletes and coaches is we're not trying to just express the fitness we have. We're trying to build fitness for a later expression down the road. And that's why it becomes this puzzle of we use all the energy systems at different times of the year, but we always have to be remembering how long is this going to last? When do we need to stimulate it again? And how does this contribute to an athlete's fitness, looking like a healthy stock market, where things are generally going up most of the time with brief corrections along the way. But yeah, what else do you kind of have to add, in kind of wrapping this up?
I think the one thing or two things that I want to close with is, and they're interrelated, is that central to both of our philosophies as coaches is that if you're happy, you're fast, and at least doing some tailoring of any of this training plan work that we're talking about to an athlete's life, but also like their preferences. Maybe an athlete in their ideal world, yeah, does absolutely nothing but group ride training, and maybe our prescribed preference would be to do maybe one group ride a week and a couple of um, structured threshold workouts in the threshold block, and the compromise that you come to is one threshold block and two group rides a week or something like that, with the explicitly communicated understanding to the athlete that like, yeah, this is not the quote unquote optimal um, training plan, but you're still going to be getting some benefits from doing that second group ride instead of a threshold workout. And if
Mhm.
that's really what you want, like, you are in this situation, at least an adult, and you can make your own decisions. Um, and if that athlete is showing up fresh and invigorated for a race as a result, then like mentally they're in the place that they need to be to do well, to achieve their goal.
Mhm.
And on top of that fun side of things, or closely linked to it, is I think it's important as an athlete and a coach to constantly be at least experimenting a little bit and trying new things,
Mhm.
um, both based on what we're reading in the literature and also just based on like thoughts and curiosity. I
Yeah.
did that heat training block a couple weeks ago just because I wanted to see what it felt like, see how it integrated into life, how it felt on my body, and as a as a novelty. And I'm very much glad I did.
Right, because now, like that we're going to do that training again, like
Hmm.
for real. I mean, all training is for real, but we'll do it, really pointing towards an adaptation that we want. And
Hmm.
you now know, like, okay, this is what it feels like. This is how I fit it logistically into my life. Like, this
Yep.
is difficult. I need to go to the gym. I need to have my heart rate monitor. I need to like ride at a fairly, quick tempo. I need to change quickly and get in the sauna
Hmm.
within a few minutes, like so when we start and doing it for real, there'll be a little bit less of that on ramp because
Yep.
coaches and self-coached athletes out there, you have to give your athlete time to like learn this new process. And like, the first time I give athletes the high cadence VO2 max thing, it might take them 2 or 3 sessions to just kind of get it right. Like, and, be able to like do that high cadence and focus on the right things and get the coordination correct. Sprinting is a great example. Like sprinting is more about coordination than big power. Like it's about coordinating your abilities to generate that power. And, if you just try to go out and start hitting really big numbers, you might crash. And like learning how to like deploy your power effectively is a skill. And so having done that block already, having done that experimentation and curiosity, like that's always a good thing to see in your athlete because it means that they're excited and engaged.
Hmm.
And so if they
Hmm.
are interested in stuff like that, you're like, okay, sweet. This is a happy athlete. This is an enthusiastic athlete. They're probably going to be doing pretty well. So, where can people find you and ask you questions about your own coaching?
You can find me on social media, primarily Instagram. My social tag is gender_deer. If you want to reach me at email, it is my legal name, robert.s.cummings.iii, as in the third, at gmail.com.
Nice. Um, well, this was awesome. Thank you so much for like just bringing it up. And any of my other athletes out there, if you have a question and you want to like do this on tape, like these are great, like because these I think give people a real understanding of like here's an N of one, here's how we're applying these lessons to this athlete, this N of one. And you know, I mean, like this has just been a really good thing for me to think about in terms of like, okay, how do I codify the thing that I do, which is sort of layering these different energy systems
Hmm.
into something, you know, there's never a rubric for effective endurance coaching. Like it's all highly individualized, but
Yep.
there are some guidelines and rules of thumb that we can stick to that make all of this a little bit more effective. So thank you so much for bringing it up because we wouldn't have had this conversation if you hadn't.
Absolutely.
Well, Robin, thank you so much for taking the time today to do this. I will see you at our next coaching call if I don't see you somewhere else before that. But thank you so much for coming to the infirmary and helping other people stay healthy.
Thanks for having me, Chris. See you soon.